All right, we're going to look at the pathway of the digestive system. So what is the digestive system? Main function. So we talked about in the previous videos of its multiple functions. Now we're going to see how everything goes, starting from the oral cavity to the anus. So starting in the oral cavity, we have a lot of mechanisms taking place. So in the oral cavity or the mouth, what happens? You have excessive salivation. So you have several salivary glands that are present. You have the parotid, located in your cheek region, lingual, sublingual, below your tongue, and also the submandibular saliva. And so what's the function of saliva? Saliva's main function is to house a majority of your immune cells, right? Because again, it's an open cavity, and every time you open your mouth, you have all these parasites coming in. Not to scare you or anything, but this is realistic, what we're talking about. And host immune cells also allow for the process of lubrication, right? So you have lubrication that takes place in the oral cavity in order to allow for swallowing or deglutition. So oral cavity has these phenomena. Also, another factor in the oral cavity is besides saliva here. So let's write that. So you have saliva for lubrication and hosing a lot of these immune cells. We also have enzymes, specifically amylases. So amylases are used to break down a lot of polysaccharides, like our starchy foods that are broken down very easily. So digestion, actually, if I were to ask you where does digestion begin, technically it doesn't start in the stomach. Technically it begins in the oral cavity. All right, and so you have amylases. You also have lingual lipases as well. So the lipases are, what do? They chemically break down the fats. So our triglycerides get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. So you have the oral cavity. Now next structure we go to, this is called the throat or the pharynx. So what's unique about the pharynx, as we mentioned before, it is the gateway between the respiratory system and the digestive system. So pharynx during the respiratory system becomes the larynx, eventually goes to the trachea, etc. But when we look at the digestive system now, the next structure that the pharynx connects to in the digestive system is called the esophagus. And so what separates the two is this flat fold called the epiglottis. So epiglottis controls entry into the digestive system. So specifically here, the esophagus. So we have the esophagus. All of the food that enters, that mixes with the saliva and the salivary enzymes are known as the bolus. And I spelled it right. All right. So the esophagus. So now all of this structure now goes down through these muscular contractions from smooth muscle, and it takes down this material called bolus. So now bolus carries all this material to this next structure we're going to call is the stomach. And the way these digestive organs are controlled when you control the food, because you don't want everything just to go pass right through, there are these specific sphincters that allow for this possibility to take place. So the esophagus goes through let's look at the sphincters. It's either called the lower esophageal or cardiac sphincter. So this sphincter takes the bolus through the motion of peristalsis into the stomach. So now you're in the stomach here, and in the stomach's main function is storage and breakdown. So we have the stomach here. All the bolus now enters the stomach, where you have high abundance of these digestive enzymes like pepsins that break down proteins. You have this excessive level of hydrochloric acid that breaks down all these molecules, and also absorption. So the only thing that happens in the stomach that's involving in absorption is any kind of alcohol group, right? So an example of this would see some kind of ethanol, methanol, water also, right? That's why they say, don't drink alcohol on an empty stomach because you absorb it really fast. And for those of you that are underage, be careful whenever you're experimenting right now, right? Because you're trying to say, okay, I know how to drink my alcohol. The best thing to do to prevent this excessive high dose of alcohol into your bloodstream, eat something. So this eating or having some kind of full stomach prevents this excessive absorption that takes place. And now you don't get that high dose of alcohol and then you get sick. Later on, you start throwing up. So eat something. It's really good. Food is good. And it helps with the absorption of alcohol. Now, the next structure that enters from the stomach. So everything that leaves the stomach, this is known as chyme, right? So we talked about bolus here. That is from the oral cavity to the stomach. And now from the stomach to the small intestine, this is called chyme. And what chyme is just a mixture of all of these materials that we have with the actual stomach acid, with the gastric juices. So now it leaves this stomach through this valve called the pyloric sphincter. So from the pyloric sphincter now we enter the small intestine. So now we enter the small intestine. And majority of further digestion takes place in the small intestine. In the small intestine is divided into 3 separate sections. You have the most proximal region to the stomach, which is the duodenum. Then you have the jejunum, and eventually you have the ileum. In the duodenum, majority of absorption and digestion takes place. Also, in the small intestine, you have a lot of your accessory organs that secrete their juices. So for example, the accessory organs like your pancreas that secrete bicarbonate and their zymogens. What else? The liver produces bile and stores it in your gallbladder. So gallbladder secretes bile. And what is bile? Bile is an emulsifier of fat. What does that mean, emulsify? Emulsify means physical breakdown. Lipases break down everything chemically, whereas bile, whenever it releases into the duodenum from the gallbladder or the liver if you don't have a gallbladder, this is physically breaking down the fats. All right, now the small intestine then connects to the large intestine through this pouch. That pouch is called the cecum. In the cecum, we have this little tail that you'll usually see. What is that tail? It's this form of lymphoid tissue. That form of lymphoid tissue is called the appendix. Inflammation of the appendix leads to other problems. And now, so here, finally finishing off with the last regions of the large intestine is the large intestine. So you have the large intestine. What is the function of the large intestine? So the function of the large intestine, the only thing it really absorbs specifically is water. Water is the only thing this large intestine specifically absorbs. Everything else, it allows for the production of vitamin K's and B's. So vitamin B and K production. B is responsible for example, it's a cofactor for a lot of enzymatic processes, but in terms of cells, it's important for red blood cell formation. K is a coagulant. So it is responsible to assist in coagulation. So people that are on blood thinners because they have some kind of excessive clotting procedure that's taking place, they always recommend you to not use or not eat any very leafy green vegetables. Leafy green vegetables have a lot of vitamin K, and so this can lead to instances of blood clotting when you don't want to have the blood clotting to take place, which is why you're on these blood thinners. What else? And you have this huge microflora of bacteria. So these microflora create the vitamin B's and the vitamin K's. All right. And also the final thing that the intestine, large intestine specifically, creates, right? So it goes from the ascending to the transverse to the descending and eventually the sinusoidal intestine. Sigmoidal. Sinusoidal, what's that? Sigmoidal intestine, so it's S-shaped, and it's stool formation, poop. It makes you make poop. And so now all of this is done and it needs to be defecated out or released out. So you go to the bathroom, you take number 2. So here it goes out next the rectum and it gets excreted out this last sphincter called the anus. And so this is a general schematic of the pathway for the digestive system. And here, let me write chyme here so you know where we're talking about. This is where it's chyme. And this is from the oral, okay.